I'm Brad Stone in San Francisco, in for Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Amazon's plans in India have hit a major roadblock thanks to strict e-commerce rules. Can the company get its global game plan back on track? Plus, Apple cracks down on internal apps from Facebook and Google. We'll discuss the fallout from the big tech standoff. And Revolution CEO Steve Case on the investment firm's latest push in Puerto Rico, and thoughts on the dysfunction in Washington. But first, to our top story. Amazon and Walmart's grand plans for India have been thrown into chaos. The Indian government has implemented new e-commerce regulations which could cut their growth in the market this year by as much as half. That was after complaints from small shops and domestic sellers. Amazon and Walmart's Flipkart are now banned from making exclusive arrangements with sellers or offering deep discounts. Joining us to discuss, Bloomberg Opinion's Shira Obade. Also with us, Bloomberg Technology's Matt Day. Matt, we'll start with you. Jeff Bezos invested $5 billion in India. He went to the country, for God's sakes, and put on ceremonial garb. So what has gone wrong for him in India?
Well, I think he kind of underestimated maybe the local economy and the nature of the small merchants that dominate the scene there. It's a country that's pretty new to e-commerce, rather than kind of a superstore model. There's a lot of little merchants that hold a lot of sway. And then you see these new rules rolled out, took effect today, actually.
Shira, we've seen Amazon do pretty well in parts of Europe. We saw them get creamed in China. They've got new businesses in Brazil and the Middle East, but India was like the place, right, where they were going to reinvigorate international growth. So what's the impact, do you think, on Amazon of these new rules?
The trouble is it's hard to know the impact, really. Amazon does not disclose their sales in India, but it's clear that that was a very important growth market for Amazon and for Jeff Bezos, and frankly for a lot of companies in the U.S. and China, which have really seen India's growing economy, growing tech usage as this kind of new gold rush. And you saw them all kind of storm in there with large investments. And now both Amazon and Walmart have this problem where they're going to have to, it seems, pull a lot of their products from their websites in India, and that's certainly going to affect their growth rates. And you saw analysts really pressing Amazon on that on the earnings call yesterday without too many direct answers from Amazon executives.
Yeah, what did Amazon say when they were asked about India?
Basically that they were still investigating what the impact was going to be, and they were working with the Indian government to try to get an extension until they could figure out the impact of some of the rules. But it's very clear that it is going to have an impact, although, again, it's hard to know exactly what that impact is going to be on Amazon's revenue and finances.
Matt, you mentioned the small sellers and the medium-sized sellers who are exerting their political muscle here, but there's also a very large company, right? Reliance Industries. We've written a little bit about them. They're a telecom giant, a retail giant, and they're now getting into the Indian e-commerce game. Any sense that this tilts the playing field to the local giants in India?
No, certainly. I think analysts who follow this say there's a bit of a protectionist angle to it. I mean, there's rules on foreign e-commerce marketplaces, and I think that the crackdown is seen as a sort of politically motivated thing to protect sort of local industry.
So moving on from India, Matt, today hasn't been a great day for Amazon investors. The last I saw, the stock was down about 5% based on yesterday's earnings report. But the company beat sales expectations. They're probably the first company, at least in Western history, to get to $200 billion in sales annually as quickly as they have. And yet the sentiment today has been negative. So aside from India, what is worrying investors now from Amazon's report yesterday?
Well, I think it's a couple things. I mean, first is their growth has slowed down a good bit. They were just on a tear for more than a decade, posting just crazy growth for a company of that size. And they, for I think it's a third consecutive quarter, came in with revenue guidance that was below what Wall Street was anticipating. So they're definitely pointing to a slowdown in the revenue number. And then secondly, on the conference call with analysts yesterday, they hinted that they might accelerate their capital spending this year, pointing to sort of the pause they put on last year, both in headcount and expansion of data centers to fuel their cloud computing business, expansion of warehouses. That all paused a bit last year. I think analysts and investors are reading into the comments yesterday that they might accelerate that spending.
Shira, there was this remarkable moment on the call yesterday with Amazon CFO where an analyst asked about this perceived slowdown in unit sales. So Amazon's core business, basically. And he responded, well, you shouldn't look at that as much as other things like advertising and AWS. You called that out as a remarkable moment. Why?
It just seems stunning. I mean, basically, the CFO of Amazon is saying, please don't pay so much attention to our e-commerce business, which is the core of what Amazon does. And I have to say, I had a little bit of a flashback to in late 2014, Amazon was going through a similar kind of growth hiccup. And on that call in late 2014, the different CFO tried to explain a slowdown in growth by saying, well, you know, we're seeing students trying to save money by renting rather than buying textbooks. And that's why you saw this kind of slow growth in sales of things like books and DVDs and movies. And it really felt like an excuse, honestly. And that's what it sounded like yesterday to me as well, kind of explaining away this slowdown in growth in unit sales by saying, well, it's just e-commerce merchandise, please pay no attention.
Well, that slowdown in 2014 was then followed by probably the most prosperous time in Amazon history and huge appreciation in the stock. So is the slowdown realer this time? Do you think the growth days are over for Amazon?
Yes, that's a good point. You're right that 2014 call came just before this enormous leg of growth for Amazon. And I don't know, this one might be temporary as well. There's all kinds of unusual factors that are weighing on Amazon's growth rate, including that the business is shifting a little bit, right, where they're selling less merchandise directly and more as kind of a middleman for these third-party sellers, which generates less revenue but higher profits. I don't really know what's going on, to be honest with you, because it seems as though the shift to e-commerce is very real in the U.S. and everywhere else, and Amazon is taking a large share of that e-commerce growth, so they should continue to keep growing, but you're not really seeing that growth in the financial numbers the last couple of quarters.
Okay, we'll be watching closely. Bloomberg Opinion's Shira Ovide and Bloomberg Technology's Matt Day. Thank you both for joining us. Now for another perspective, I sat down with Revolution CEO Steve Case to hear what he had to say about Amazon's decision to expand in New York. Take a listen.
I respect the fact that they asked people for proposals and got 235 proposals from different cities. What I reminded all those cities when I met with some mayors recently is if they took half of the energy that went into their Amazon bid and half of the dollars they're willing to put on the table to incent Amazon to come there and refocus on their startup community, they might create the next Amazon. So hopefully this effort, even though most of the cities who applied and pitched lost, hopefully that energy will go into their startup sector, which will bear fruit down the road. In terms of the cities they picked, I wasn't particularly surprised about the Northern Virginia here in the D.C. area. That was a logical pick. I kind of expected, a lot of people expected that for a whole host of reasons. You know, the decision to also go to New York was a little bit of a surprise, and I think the community there seemed a little surprised as well. So perhaps there was a miscalculation there. I personally, because of my enthusiasm about Rise of Rest, of course, having started and scaled AOL here, not too far from where Amazon's site and the national landing will be in Virginia, I'm supportive of trying to do more things here. But I also was delighted they, at the last minute, also added Nashville are going to create 5,000 jobs in Nashville. Hopefully, they and other companies, Google now, Apple, Facebook, are opening offices in Pittsburgh, Ann Arbor, other parts of the country. We need to have a more inclusive approach to innovation, have more people, more communities have reason to be optimistic about the future, not feeling like they're getting left behind.
Well, Steve, if you were part of that decision-making committee at Amazon and you see local resistance in Queens digging in, what do you do? I mean, they're taking their appeal to residents right now. What's the way forward for Amazon?
Well, I don't know all the details in New York, and Jeff Bezos is a friend and also an investor in our Rise of the Rest fund. So he has a great team. I'm sure they'll figure it out in terms of reaching out to the community, which I believe they've spent a lot of time on in the last few weeks, and figuring out, is there a path forward, or do they need to kind of recalibrate?
That was part of my conversation with Revolution CEO Steve Case. We'll have more of that interview later in the hour. Coming up, big tech faced off this week over privacy, with Apple temporarily pulling app development tools from Facebook and Google. We'll speak to Jim Steyer, CEO of Common Sense Media, to get his outlook. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. You can listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on Sirius XM. This is Bloomberg. The same week that saw Facebook announce a record profit, it was revealed the company had been paying users, some as young as 13 years old, to monitor their data. Apple revoked Facebook's enterprise certificate, saying they used an internal app to gather external research. But the iPhone maker later restored it. Facebook's COO defended the company's practices in an interview with Bloomberg TV on Wednesday. Take a listen.
What matters is that people know how their information is being used. And in this particular case, the people using the research app in the study knew they were in it and knew how their information was being used. But you are right that it has been a challenging time for Facebook, and we need to earn back people's trust.
So can Facebook regain people's trust? To discuss, I'd like to welcome Jim Steyer, CEO of Common Sense Media. And Jim, thanks for joining.
Good to be here, Brad.
So you wrote a book, 2012, Talking Back to Facebook.
Correct.
So if you were to talk back to Facebook today after this week's and this year's revelations, what would you say?
Wow, what a catastrophe. You guys really need to clean up your act. And I would say to Cheryl, you know, in the case of the research app that they were paying people to use, I completely disagree that a 13-year-old knows why you're paying them $20 a month. They just are happy to get that little bonus.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second. They said in their defense that the disclosure forms were clear, that everybody did it voluntarily, and that it was a small, maybe 5% group that were teenagers.
I would say the disclosure forms were as clear as the 87-page privacy policy that you get on your iPhone that you never read and you just check yes, accept. And I think that's the issue, actually, is that the average kid actually may be smarter than the average parent these days about tech, but they don't read those disclosure forms. And the truth is, it was a sort of a bait and switch kind of thing, which is exactly why Apple shut them down. And I thought that was an important moment, if you will, in recent tech history, what Apple did to both Facebook and Google.
Right, and let's talk about that. I mean, does it make you uncomfortable at all that Apple was able to significantly hurt a business and its internal operations with a flick of a switch?
No, it does not make me uncomfortable. In fact, it makes me respect Apple and Tim Cook and the other folks who made the decision. Because, look, until we get more common sense regulation of the tech industry, which, as you know, Brad, Common Sense Media is leading the charge for, like the Privacy Act in California last year, I actually think you need the better minds in the industry to stand up and say this is just wrong. And clearly, Apple and Tim are taking the lead role.
Although we should say that they have had their own little skirmishes lately, the FaceTime bug that they have yet to fix.
Agreed, it is a bug, but they were honest about it. They weren't defensive, and they actually went out, and I'll tell you this. I think Tim standing up to Facebook and Google is incredibly important, and the company to do that. Look, Mark Benioff, as we all know, has stood up to Facebook and talked particularly about addiction and attention issues. I think it's important for the tech industry to speak out, because remember, the tech industry is not monolithic. A lot of times people think the tech industry broadly. Oh, no. Apple is very different than Facebook. And I actually think what Apple did in this case was completely thoughtful, respectful. They shut it down after a day. They taught them a lesson. And in the absence of common sense regulation by the government, who've been missing in action, I actually think what Apple did is excellent.
And you make a good point by saying the tech industry is not monolithic. You know, a lot of questions are being asked right now of Facebook and to some extent Google.
Right.
What kind of questions should we be asking other tech companies like Amazon, which is itself building a very large advertising?
Correct. I agree with you. And I think that your last segment with my friend Steve Case was quite interesting in that regard. I think we have to be asking folks, what's your responsibility to society? I actually think, look, tech has created so much great benefits for all of us, but it's also, there have been many unintended consequences, particularly in the realm of Facebook and Instagram, et cetera. And I think we've seen that, the hacking of our democracy, the impact on children, the privacy issues. We're coming to terms with that with as a society. So you have to see leadership by the tech industry itself, and you also have to see common sense government regulation. And I think what you saw last year in California, the effort we led to have a comprehensive privacy protection for consumers, we need more of that. But we also need to understand that the really smart, good people in the tech industry need to stand up and do the right thing.
When Cheryl and Mark say they want national, federal privacy legislation, when they say that Facebook has changed and they're focusing efforts on privacy, on monitoring fake news, do you take them at their word?
No, it's all about putting your money where your mouth is. I think you have to just show up because, look, I really know Cheryl well and respect her. I respect Mark tremendously for the business they built. But I think with the series of problems that we've seen on the democracy side, on the transparency side, on the kids front, they owe the public a massive changes in the company's behavior. And quite honestly, stop being defensive, get out there and change things. It's been a great company, but it has enormous problems right now.
So what significant steps would you like to see them take that they haven't taken already?
They should shut down Messenger Kids. We've called on that, and we did it again this week because of the friendly fraud of kids as whales, where they're having in-app purchases.
Explain that. That was information that came out of a lawsuit that showed that kids were inadvertently running up very large bills on Facebook.
And Facebook was keeping the money and calling them whales like gamblers in Las Vegas, right? So that's just unethical. That's just inappropriate. And I think what we need to see is fundamental behavior change. And Messenger Kids is aimed at kids under 13. Kids under 13 don't need to be on a social network. You don't need Facebook Messenger Kids. I would shut that down today. And I would stop doing things like they did with the research app, which was just a way to get teens to reveal their private information to Facebook, which they could then monetize. I think you have to practice what you preach. And I think that this is a really big challenge to Mark and Cheryl and the rest of the people who run the company. They are good people in many ways. They've made great contributions to our society, but they need to stand up and change major practices at Facebook. And we need the tech industry to have honest discussions. What Tim and Apple did is right, and they should be applauded. And it may have pissed off Facebook and Google. Too bad. They were standing up for what they believe and what their policies are, and we applaud them for that.
Okay, Jim Steyer of Common Sense Media, thanks for joining us. Coming up, Foxconn says it will go ahead with plans to build a factory in Wisconsin after a conversation with Chairman Terry Gou and President Trump. We'll have the details behind the discussion next. And Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. After days of reports on whether or not Foxconn will continue building a factory in the U.S. state of Wisconsin, the Taiwanese company says it will proceed with its plans. The decision was made after President Trump and company chairman Terry Gou discussed the matter. The company has promised to bring 13,000 jobs to the Badger State. For more, I want to bring in Bloomberg Technology's Austin Carr. Austin, you've been following this saga now for quite some time. It's really an incredible story. So tell us about this latest turn.
Yeah, it's been quite an interesting week for Foxconn. There's been a lot of will they, won't they tension about the company's plans in Wisconsin. Basically, earlier this week, there was reports out that they were going to draw back on this big plan to create 13,000 jobs in the state and not create this big LCD factory where all the jobs would be. Then just a day after that, they said they're not 100% sure. They're still reconsidering their plans for an LCD factory. And then just today, after President Trump and Foxconn Chairman Terry Gou had a conversation, suddenly they're back on for this LCD factory in Wisconsin. So it's just been sort of a surprising week of developments that have been really confusing, not only for observers of the company, but also for state officials in Wisconsin who are really concerned about the future of this deal.
Any idea what Trump promised Foxconn?
Well, Trump has actually been involved from the get-go from this deal. Some of the earliest discussions for this deal actually took place at the White House back in early 2017. And President Trump has been involved at groundbreaking ceremonies. He was there for the big announcement with Chairman Terry Gou, in part because this has been central to his big campaign pledge to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. from places like China. It's a big portion of his sort of argument around the trade war that he's waging right now with China as well. So as this deal seemed to be crumbling and falling apart in the last week, there was no doubt he had to apply some pressure to Chairman Gou to sort of get him to commit or recommit, I guess, to the promises that they've made to the state of Wisconsin. Otherwise, it would have looked really bad for President Trump and some of the commitments he's made to his supporters.
What I find so curious about this, Austin, is that locally in Wisconsin, it doesn't seem to be that popular. Scott Walker, the governor, lost his re-election bid, and people were attributing that to some extent to this deal. And yet nationally, obviously, Trump is really invested in it.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, it was such a contentious issue during the debate. In fact, Governor Walker, as you mentioned, lost to the new Wisconsin governor, Tony Evers. And part of that sort of unpopularity, that controversy, stems from the fact that this deal has been extremely confusing. It's gone through a lot of evolution since it was actually signed into contract in November 2017. At first, the company said that this was going to be a big factory to employ vast majority of factory workers at this big plant, up to 13,000. And then later on, they actually switched that plan and said they were actually going to be, quote, knowledge workers, which may mean engineers or scientists, people aren't really sure. They also committed to building what's called a Generation 10.5 LCD factory. But then later on, they scaled that back and said they were just going to build a Generation 6 factory, which is a much smaller factory. So this plan just keeps going through changes. As Governor Evers had told me recently, this sort of deal with the state has had one asterisk after the other.
Austin, what are they going to build? You said that they're kind of reducing the footprint. Is it still displays?
According to Louis Wu and Chairman Go, Louis Wu is the special advisor to Chairman Go. They are going to still build LCDs, but it's sort of TBD what their overall ambition is in the state. They've had these sort of big talks around building R&D centers, innovation centers. They keep talking about this ecosystem of 8K streaming video and artificial intelligence, as well as 5G wireless networking. But if you talk to people on the ground there, it's really amorphous. It's not quite well defined, and it just keeps going through all these changes. But I think larger than that, more recently, they actually just missed their hiring goals for the first year with the state by for their max target, about 82%. So that's quite of a whopping disparity between what they had promised just about a year ago.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We will keep watching. Bloomberg Technology's Austin Carr, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
Coming up, the trial over the rollback of net neutrality begins in Washington. We'll hear from the COO of Mozilla, who's leading the fight to restore the regulations. Plus, could the next big tech company be outside Silicon Valley? DC investment firm Revolution heads to Florida for an answer. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Brad Stone in San Francisco. Back in December 2017, the FCC voted along party lines to repeal net neutrality. Those Obama-era protections were designed to basically keep internet speeds equal for all, so that internet service providers couldn't throttle your internet or create fast lanes for their own content. On Friday, net neutrality backers took their case to court to stop the repeal. Internet company Mozilla is leading the plaintiff's case against the federal government. Joining me now is COO of Mozilla, Danelle Dixon. She has also served as Mozilla's chief legal officer. Danelle, thanks for joining us. I gather you weren't in Washington, D.C. Today. It's very cold there, probably better here, but you listened to the oral argument, so tell us what happened today.
Yeah, so we feel really good about how the oral argument went. It went for 5 hours, and so it's getting the attention and the importance that this issue deserves. It's a really important piece. What we felt about today is that they talked a lot about the reprioritization, which gets into the weeds a little bit about the net neutrality debate, but whether these companies should be telecommunications companies, which we all think that they should be from our side. And then also there was a lot of really interesting discussion around paid prioritization and around blocking and throttling, and an admission that this isn't something that those companies want to do. So from our side, we say, if you don't want to do it, then why do we have to repeal the rules?
So this case is called Mozilla versus FCC. So tell me why you guys are taking the lead here.
This is a really important issue to consumers. Like, this is a really important issue to ensure that we have an open web. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's not relevant to all the products on the web, but really this is about openness and transparency and availability and access to content, all content on the web. This is a consumer protection issue. And we want to see this continue to for consumers to have all the access to all the content that they want all over the world. So this is an important issue for us.
You know, make this relevant to listeners, to viewers out there who might think that since Obama-era regulations have been overturned, not much has changed. Now, perhaps the new rules have never fully gone into effect. You can tell me, but what are the stakes right now?
Well, everyone's acting on their best behavior. Here we have a situation where nothing's really set in stone yet. And so, of course, we're not going to see the paid prioritization, the blocking of the throttling. We're seeing little bits and pieces being taken away. This isn't a change that happens overnight. But to make it real, just think about the notion, we have 50% of America that doesn't actually have choice with respect to ISPs. Now, what about if those ISPs just decided they only want to show one piece of content? What about minority views never being expressed? Small businesses never getting access to those consumers? These are all real issues that involve all of us.
So, Danelle, Matthew Berry, the FCC Chief of Staff, just put out a statement. I want to read it briefly here and maybe get your response. He said the U.S. Supreme Court has already affirmed the FCC's authority to classify broadband as a Title I information service. And after today's argument, we continue to believe that the judiciary will uphold the FCC's decision to return to that regulatory framework. Perhaps nothing surprising here, but what do you make of it?
So nothing surprising at all. That would be the position I would say if I was on their side. But listen, there's a deference that's allotted to the FCC with respect to the judgments that they make if they do their homework. And they didn't do their homework here with respect to their classification issues. They didn't actually demonstrate that there was a need for a change. So I disagree wholeheartedly with what this court is going to do, and I think we saw some of that being expressed today by the judges that are hearing the case.
So one of the things that we've seen over the last year and a half is states all around the country, I think 30 up till now, passing their own net neutrality regulations, state of California included. So what are the prospects here for the state laws? Do you anticipate Congress acting and maybe wiping all those rules off the books?
Well, there's certainly a lot of those things that can happen. There were preemption arguments made today with respect to some of these state issues. What we want to see is we want to win this case. We win this case and we repeal or we get rid of that and we go back to the 2015 order. That's where we should be. That's status quo. That's where the internet should be. And then hopefully we won't have to get into any of those debates.
Well, let me raise the other less hopeful scenario for you, that the FCC prevails. What is the way forward in that case?
Well, from our standpoint, we're going to keep fighting. I don't know exactly what that looks like. We hope to win this case. If we don't, Mozilla is in this for the long haul because we look at this from the consumer standpoint. I can assure you that the folks that are participating with us in this litigation, they're in it for the long haul too. So whatever it takes, we're going to fight for net neutrality.
Asking a divided Congress to address anything these days is maybe a long shot, but do you see this Congress acting on net neutrality?
We hear rumors that things like that might come up. I think that the only way that any legislation with respect to net neutrality is going to be valid is if it essentially aligns with the way the rules were set in 2015. So I don't know what that's going to look like. I think it would be hard to make that happen in this Congress. Again, I don't want to go there because I think that we'll win this litigation. So
the case is Mozilla versus FCC, but there are a lot of other parties here, some of whom we heard from today. Talk about the different interests aligning on both sides of this debate.
Well, that's the beautiful thing. We have 23 states attorneys general, we have public interest groups, and we have other companies along with us. It sort of shows you that this isn't an issue that should divide folks. It's an issue that should unite folks. We've constantly said time and time again, this isn't a partisan issue. This is actually an issue where we can all agree along the lines that the internet is actually not, it's not a privilege. It's something that everybody uses. People use it to get jobs. They use it to get information about their family all over the world. So this is something that we need to protect. And so this is the wonderful thing about this case, is it unites all of us across the board.
So tell me more about this procedure. How long will it go on? What can we expect in the days ahead?
It's hard to know. I mean, the court has to make its decision. We look forward to seeing the court's order. Sometimes it can come out in a really short period of time. We want the court to spend the time that it needs on this. So oftentimes when you're dealing with litigation, it takes a long time for these things to happen.
Okay, more ahead. Thank you, Danelle Dixon of Mozilla. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Coming up, Silicon Valley is notorious for its startups, but investment firm Revolution is looking for the next big tech company elsewhere. We'll tell you where it's taking its search next. This is Bloomberg. Revolution, the investment firm co-founded by former AOL CEO Steve Case, has announced its next Rise of the Rest bus tour. Starting April 29th, the Revolution investment team will head to 4 Florida cities and Puerto Rico to highlight their emerging startup economies. It's the 7th tour for Rise of the Rest, Revolution's nationwide effort to back startups outside of Silicon Valley and New York. I spoke with Steve Case earlier. Take a listen.
We've done 7 of these road trips so far. We've hit 38 cities all across the country, and this time, as you say, we're going to Florida, 4 cities in Florida, then Puerto Rico. And the whole effort, when we started almost 5 years ago, is really shine a spotlight on the regions around the country. They're showing momentum around their startup communities, and particularly the entrepreneurs that need more venture capital to drive their companies forward, but also need people to be paying attention to what's happening. As you know, most of the venture capital last year, 75% of the venture capital went to 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. So the other 47 states fought over the other 25%. We're trying to change that and level the playing field so everybody everywhere who has an idea, a startup idea, really has a shot of moving it forward.
Okay, well, let's start with Florida. It's not, I think, known in the popular imagination for technology entrepreneurship, but that's not quite right. Magic Leap is down in Plantation. You got Chewy, which was acquired by PetSmart 2 years ago. You know, tell me about the Florida startup ecosystem and why you find it promising.
Well, it's the 3rd largest state in the country, and yet it gets less than 2% of venture capital. So it just feels like there's a little bit of an imbalance. And you say the success of Chewy, a $3 billion exit, or Magic Leap, they've raised $2 billion from Google and Alibaba and others to create a very significant company in the AR space. They've hired hundreds of engineers, many of them relocating from Silicon Valley to South Florida. So there's a lot of things happening there. Our tour is going to be in Orlando, which is best known for hospitality and Disney, but it's already becoming a strong startup city. We're going to the Space Coast, a lot of space tech companies, and we're actually inviting startups from all over the country in space tech or robots or aviation to pitch at the Space Coast pitch competition. We're going to Tampa Bay, a lot of interesting things happening there. Jeff Vinnick and Bill Gates are investing heavily in reinventing the downtown area and making it focusing more on startups. And finally, in Miami, which is emerging as one of the global cities and really emerging as a strong startup ecosystem as well. And then the last day on Friday, we're going to Puerto Rico, which everybody's focused on some of the problems they've had post-hurricane and the rebuilding, sort of the relief efforts, which obviously have been very important. But now I think the focus is on really rebuilding the economy and focusing on the industries of the future, the jobs of the future, and therefore you got to be more supportive of startups. So it should be a great week.
That was my next question about Puerto Rico. It's now been over a year since the devastation of Hurricane Maria. They're worrying about basic infrastructure. So what are the opportunities for entrepreneurship and tech startups when the basics right now are sorely lacking?
Well, some of that is the opportunity. I was there a few weeks ago with Jose Andres, who will be joining us for our Rise of Rest tour there early in May. Obviously, Lin-Manuel Miranda was there with Hamilton, and it had the rebuilding. We spent a day traveling around seeing what was happening. But part of what's happening is entrepreneurs now are recognizing they need to create a more resilient and self-sufficient and sustainable economy. Over 85–90% of the food on the island comes from other places. So how do you create more sustainable agriculture? They do have some challenges with the electricity, other kinds of things. How do entrepreneurs focus on that, as well as sort of the core startup sector? We've visited an accelerator there. Endeavor is doing some great work there. So there's a recognition that it's not just the startups that might start there and sell their products or services elsewhere around the country or elsewhere around the world, but also what are the startups can really create a stronger, more sustainable economy in Puerto Rico.
So, Steve, founders in Puerto Rico and in those 4 cities in Florida that you'll be visiting, I'm sure are eager to meet you, to meet your partner, J.D. Vance, also the author of Hillbilly Elegy, but probably interested in whether they can raise money. So to what extent on these bus tours do you open up the wallet and make investments from that $150 million Rise of the Rest fund?
Well, we do in every city we visited. We do have a pitch competition, and part of the reason we announced the tour today and tell people to go to the risetherest.com website is so entrepreneurs in those cities can basically apply for the pitch competition. Usually 80 or 100 apply to pitch in each city. We pick the best 8 to be on stage. We get a panel of judges, some of our team, but also people from that city, and then we pick a winner, and we will invest $100,000 in that company. But part of our goal is to make sure all those companies on the stage get more attention. Hopefully all of them get other investors. And also through our Rise the Rest seed fund, which, as you mentioned, we launched just over a year ago and have 40 of the most iconic investors and entrepreneurs in the country as part of that. We also find other companies outside the pitch competition that we've invested in. So far, that Rise the Rest fund, we've invested in more than 100 companies in over 50 cities. And so there's a lot of great entrepreneurs everywhere. It's just most of the venture capital in places like Silicon Valley is focused in their backyard. In New York City or Boston is similarly focused in their area. There's not enough focus on what's happening in the rest of the country, and that's what we're trying to change with Rise of the Rest.
Okay, Steve, let's bring it closer to home. We're potentially 2 weeks away from another impasse over the border wall and maybe another government shutdown. Are you worried about the business implications of that?
Yeah, I think hopefully everybody's learned the lesson of the last shutdown, which was sort of a standoff, and hopefully, I know there are a number of people who are working as part of the 17-member group that's trying to figure out what is the compromise, how do we move forward in a way that can avoid this shutdown and maybe even put legislation in place, such as what Senator Warner's proposed, so that this kind of shutdown doesn't happen on a regular basis. It's clearly not helpful to the economy, clearly not helpful in terms of people's everyday lives. I just came an hour ago from the World Central Kitchen here in Washington, D.C. that Jose Andres put together, and there's still a line outside the door, even though it's quite cold and snowy here, because a lot of families really are having a tough time. Even though the government's reopened, there are contractors that weren't getting paid and aren't going to get paid. So this kind of thing is not good for the country. It's not good for the community. It's not good for the people working for either directly or indirectly for the government. So we have to figure out a path forward that doesn't turn this into a every few weeks kind of a political standoff.
Well, in the search for longer-term solutions, prospective presidential candidates, including Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, have been proposing all manners of new taxes, particularly on the wealthiest Americans, including a 77% estate tax. And I'm curious how you feel about that.
Well, I'm open to looking at new kind of taxes, and certainly I've done well, and I'd be happy to pay more taxes as long as it goes into programs that can be helpful, including things like education and efforts around entrepreneurship and job training and so forth. But more broadly, I'd say part of my focus really the last 10 years has been to stay out of politics. I do focus on policy, worked on things like the Jobs Act, well, 5-6 years ago. More recently worked on the Investing in Opportunity Act that created opportunity zones as part of the tax reform a year ago. I'm happy to engage on anything that could be supportive of innovation and entrepreneurship, but I only do it in a bipartisan way. So I'll stay out of the game of predicting what might happen in the presidential election.
Okay, well, let me just ask you for one detail. Are there tax approaches that you favor, like an estate tax versus Elizabeth Warren's proposed tax? I think it's 3% over assets over $1 billion.
My focus, really my expertise, has been around what are the incentives that could drive more investment in the companies in these Rise the Rest cities, help rebuilding the communities, help creating jobs. So things like, as part of tax reform, as I mentioned, the opportunity zones were just created a little over a year ago. Getting those right, and there's still some rules that the Treasury is looking at that are necessary to get that right. It will fuel investment in neighborhoods in terms of real estate opportunities, but it's also very important that the rules be designed in a way that fuels investment in companies that can create jobs. That's really been the area of focus. The other aspects of the tax things, is not really my area of expertise.
That was my interview with Revolution Chairman and CEO Steve Case. And a quick note, Michael R. Bloomberg, founder and majority owner of Bloomberg LP, the parent company of Bloomberg News, is an investor in the fund, according to Revolution. And still ahead, California is still recovering from wildfires which damaged thousands of acres of land. Could drones lead the recovery? We'll discuss next. This is Bloomberg. Drone Seed is a startup that works in post-fire environments to plant native trees and vegetation using drones. The company gets paid by the acre for planting trees and protecting forests from invasive species. On Friday, the company announced a contract with Nature Conservancy, the world's largest conservation organization, to restore habitats across 5 U.S. states. Joining us now, Grant Canary, Drone Seed CEO. Grant, thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure.
So obviously, we all watched the terrible wildfires in California last summer. There are wildfires currently now in Australia and Tasmania. What are the prospects for this kind of technology to address this terrible trend?
Yeah, well, so as far as this trend, I can get into the numbers and we'll go there, but we can talk about the technology first and figure out what we're doing. So we do precision forestry, so as you mentioned, as per acre as a service, planting trees, spraying to protect them, monitoring their growth. And we do that with drone swarms, so not just one drone, but up to 5 aircraft at a time. And what's valuable about that is each aircraft can carry up to 57 pounds of payload. So that's seed, that's spray. We're the first ever to get that FAA approval this year to allow aircraft to be over the 55-pound limit. So that's incredibly powerful. This program's talked about Techlash, and do we have a technology looking for a problem? No, the answer, we went out there and before we built anything, we asked nursery managers, we asked foresters, and we said, hey, what are your pain points? How can we solve this? And this was the solution, was drones, was coming at this and really figuring that out.
And by the way, Grant, in the video, you do see some red-vested workers there monitoring the drones. Can they be completely automated and reach remote areas?
Complete automation, we want to go to a direction of automation because we want those workers to be able to do more acres over a much shorter period of time. I would love to queue up some video here about what the current method looks like. But basically, if you look at the current tree planting methods, what you're able to see is that those people who do that work are superheroes. They burn the caloric equivalent of running 2 marathons every day. And so what we want to do is take that to a place of automation where those same people can be servicing a much larger acreage each year. If you've thought to yourself, wow, it seems like there's a lot more wildfires there than there have been in the past, that you'd be entirely correct. Back in 1992, you were looking at something like the 10-year average for acres burned was around 2.7 million acres. And you fast forward today, we're around 7 million acres burned each year. That's the 10-year rolling average. So some years that's 10 million, some years that's 7 million. So that's a very, very big problem to deal with. For context, because that's a big number, that's 7 times what the largest timber company in the United States plants each year. And that number is only projected to go up.
Okay, so talk about how reforesting is part of the answer.
Yeah, so we're incredibly pleased to be working with Nature Conservancy. They're the world's largest land conservation organization. They have $1 billion global operating budget, and one of the things that they've highlighted in a recent paper is natural climate solutions. So natural climate solutions is fancy talk for planting trees, restoring rangelands, and then responding to wildfires. Their assessment is that we can respond to about 1/3 of the emissions required, the reductions, under the Paris Agreement, simply by doing those things, natural climate solutions. It's the forgotten solution. We look at shiny tech a lot. I'm a big fan of it, but at the same time, there's technology that's evolved over eons, and that's nature, and it's really good at sequestering carbon.
So Grant, talk about Drone Seed as a business. You've raised over $5 million. What's the prospect for deploying this at scale and eventually creating a profitable company?
Yeah, so the investor thesis, Social Capital, Spiro Ventures, their thesis for us when we raised was, look, we've got companies in our portfolio, Saildrone, for example, working for NOAA, saving them gobs of money as they go out and accumulate data. And then you've got Aclima, which is another, which is doing hyperlocal parts per million identification of pollution sources. So they look at that and they say, wow, you're acquiring data, you're solving a really big pain point for a government entity, state, local, federal. Now we want to see actually going beyond that. We want to see an actual remedy to a problem. So we're one of the first companies that's doing that. We're actually planting trees, spraying to protect them, and doing it in a scalable way. That scalable way for us, what that looks like is setting up a hangar, expanding from the Northwest down to California, and then reducing our COGS by setting up those hangars and then cloning those all across the South and then internationally as well. New Zealand, for example, Ministry of Forestry, Shane Jones, set aside $245 million for tree planting projects to comply with the Paris Agreement. That's interesting to us.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Grant Canary, DroneSeed CEO, thank you for joining us. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. And remember, Bloomberg Technology is live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology and be sure to follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.